Hey guys, I wanted to do a 5-minute lowdown on police violence in response to the news of Daniel Shaver's shooting and his, the officer who shot him, Philip Brailsford, being acquitted on the second-degree murder charge, and why these cases have trouble. And why they're difficult to talk about. And I'm going to do it a little bit from a defense attorney perspective, so bear with me. Let's see. Here's the weird thing. So when you're a defense attorney looking at this, you've got two defendants, right? You've got the deceased, who was initially usually the suspect of some sort of crime, by a police officer. In this case, the police were responding to Shaver, apparently, allegedly, showing off his pellet gun, potentially pointing that pellet gun outside of the window of his hotel room, which is on the 5th floor of a La Quinta. La Quinta is Spanish for next to Denny's, if you don't know. So apparently he's waving this gun out the window. So the police respond to a person in a hotel with a gun. This was prior to the Las Vegas shooting, so none of that drama is built into this case. But still, you've got a potential gun, potentially armed suspect, at a hotel. So they're proceeding with caution here. If you watch the video, and I'll link it in the description, I strongly suggest watching the video if you can stomach it. Do know that a man is murdered on screen, so it's a little hard to deal with for some people. But when you watch the video, you can see the whole process breakdown. And so you have the defendant, from the defense perspective, is the deceased, but you've also got the officer who is charged with second-degree murder in this case. And so there's kind of an inner turmoil for defense attorneys, because you want to defend both of them, and that would be your job, is to defend one or the other. But let's talk really quickly about why police officers don't go to jail for this stuff. Because, if you watch the video, there may be some argument about the movement of the hand towards the waistband, and that is justifying the shooting. And that's certainly the argument that the officer's defense attorney used, and that's the argument that it seems the jurors have latched onto in finding him not guilty. But it's more complicated than that. So defenses, affirmative defenses for crime like self-defense, justifiable use of deadly force, they're pretty fact-intensive for a normal human. For police officers, they're not as fact-intensive, right? Because this guy was unarmed. They have him in total control the entire time. What really bothers me about it is they've got 5 officers, 1 unarmed drunk guy, and they're making him waddle down the hallway on his knees when they could have done multiple other approaches. For example, they could have had him stand up, put his hand on his head, turn around and walk backwards towards police officers. So, turning around to shoot them would cause an excessive amount of movement. They could have had him simply lay there and had another police officer go. But let me focus back. I'm not good at these short videos. There's something that defense attorneys deal with all the time, and it's called the law enforcement bias. And this is a bias in the minds of judges, in the minds of jurors, in the minds of everybody, that a police officer is a good guy doing a good thing. And so you probably experienced this bias. It took me a long time to kind of break away from it. But when you're driving past someone and they're outside of their car being searched by a police officer, right? They're pulled over and a cop is rifling through their person or going through their possessions, and their hands are on the hood of the car, on the back of the car, or even they're handcuffed sitting on the curb. Is your first thought, what did that person do? Because if your first thought is, what did that person do, you have a law enforcement bias. And I bet, if you're honest with yourself, that's your first thought almost every time. Maybe not for all of you, but a lot of you, I'm sure that's true. If you have that bias, you have forgotten the whole presumption of innocence, which is part of liberty. You're innocent until proven guilty. When you are on the side of the road and the cop is looking through your car, you are innocent at that point. You have not been found guilty of any crime. Likely you haven't been charged with any crime. They're trying to find evidence at that point. But that law enforcement bias, it translates into the courtroom in ways that are really frustrating. First of all, a police officer is rarely, if ever, thought to be lying on the stand. Yet, in my experience, they lie with some regularity, right? They lie about all sorts of things. And lie might be a little bit of a stretch, but an embellishment of the truth. Remembering facts that they were not aware of at the time of the incident. Those types of things, those go into the courtroom and they're not questioned because they're a police officer. But police officers are people, right? If you're skeptical of eyewitness testimony, and you should be, then you should definitely be skeptical of a police officer. And triply skeptical of someone who either is or was near an officer-involved shooting. Because they're going to remember facts later on that they were not processing at the time. It's impossible for you to coolly and calmly process a factual scenario when you're shooting at someone, right? Like, you're under adrenaline, your body is tensed up. This is part of the problem with police violence, is they're acting not as reasonable persons, and that's the standard we apply to people. But they're not acting reasonably. When they come in and testify later, they're going to talk about all sorts of things that they experience. And we think, because of the badge, because of the training, that they're afforded some sort of special privilege. And when I say we think, I mean this is a subconscious act that happens. It's not intentional usually. But they're afforded a lot more leeway and a lot more authority in a courtroom just by walking in with that uniform and having that badge. The next part of the law enforcement bias that's problematic, especially in these types of cases, is we know that if a cop goes to jail, it's, in a lot of ways, it could be worse than just your average person going to jail, especially if they find out that this is an officer inside. So the punishment seems more severe for a police officer, or at least that's the assumption, than another person. So they want to be... People have an automatic check and say, wait a minute, this is an officer, and if I get this wrong, I'm not just locking him up and depriving him of his liberty, I'm putting him in an extended amount of mortal danger due to the nature of his work. So that's a problem that comes in as well. But finally, the last part of law enforcement bias is we think that the training that these guys undergo affords them some extra insight. And that may be true. Like, for veteran officers who have seen a lot, who have maybe been fired at and in firefights over the course of their career, they might have a cooler approach. But your average officer, I mean, I don't know statistics on this, but I think we way overestimate the amount of violence and gunfire, especially, that your average officer sees. And I hope we do. I hope we overestimate that. But my point in all this is that the amount of training that these guys get is insufficient. Nothing is sufficient to prepare you for being shot at or shooting at someone. Even having a gun pointed at you by someone outside of a training situation, there's very little that you can do to train for this. And most people, there's no predictor on how they'll react. So all of these things stack up to this law enforcement bias. It makes it very hard to get police convictions. And I mean, the conviction rates go for themselves. Daniel Shaver's shooter, Philip Brailsford, he's guilty of something. And actually, I would argue that the other cops in the hall are guilty as well. But the hard part of it is thinking, are they guilty of murder? I'm not sure. Do they deserve to go to prison? And in a general population prison for a violent crime it's a hard thing to send a cop there. But we've got to start figuring out how to reduce the shootings of citizens by the state. It just has to happen. It doesn't matter about color. That's a whole different discussion. Race, gender, any of that stuff can be discussed in other forums. For me, for liberty, we have to stop letting the state execute people. We have to find an alternative method. So I know I said 5 minutes. This is 10 minutes. I hope this is somewhat informative. I'd like to do a longer video on this, but you know, I just wanted to quick hit it, talk about the law enforcement bias a little bit, and understand that if you read, sorry, I'm gonna ramble on just a little bit longer. I apologize. If you read some articles by guys like Sean King, they're going to talk about these Supreme Court cases that happen and have established this dangerous precedent which allows cops to get off. No. Sean King is right that there's a problem. Sean King is wrong on what the problem is and the source of the problem. The two court cases he cites, I don't remember which ones they are specifically. Maybe I'll do videos on them. But he says they create this special privilege for police to shoot because they have a belief that someone is dangerous. But the standard for the justifiable use of force by an officer is actually the same in many states. I guess I can't speak for all of them, but it's the same in many states as it is for your average person, right? If they have a reasonable fear of imminent gross bodily harm, this is a Minnesota standard, reasonable fear of imminent gross bodily harm for them or someone else, they're allowed to use lethal force. Gross bodily harm is severe harm that could cause death. We're talking massive head trauma, attacking with a weapon, something that could result in a broken or lost limb. If they have the fear that this is going to happen, they're authorized in using deadly force. In Minnesota and in many other states, that's the same for a citizen. If you see someone attempting to kill another person, you can stop them. You can stop them with deadly force. That's not legal advice, by the way. Check with your state. Take a concealed carry class. Learn about how your state handles these sorts of things. Talk to a lawyer about it. But I just want to... This is just very high level, right? The Supreme Court case that what's his face is talking about, Sean King. They're talking about matters of law, and when you get to a jury trial and a conviction, like these are fact specific, and they use a fact finder. That's the jury. They're not so concerned with matter of law judgments. That's what you use on appeal if you're found guilty. That's when you're busting out these Supreme Court cases. I mean, you use them in argument for sure, but like what he's citing isn't some special privilege that police officer has that a judge tells the jury some magic words and makes them acquit. The law enforcement bias, I'm telling you, is one of the strongest things you'll find with the average person. It's the strongest thing you can find in a courtroom. It's very difficult to overcome for defense attorneys because we have to basically paint someone who, ostensibly is protecting us and our families as well as a liar. Like, we have to point that out, and it's a very uncomfortable thing to do. And judges work with these cops, right? Like, they come in and testify all the time. So when they come in and testify frequently on all sorts of matters, a judge gets to know them in the county that they work. It gets really hard to think that they're lying to you now. The reality, the scary reality, is they may have been lying to the judge all along. But that bias clouds the ability of a judge or even attorneys, anybody who's looking at a law enforcement officer and has any respect for law enforcement. That bias clouds their ability to be objective and to say, you know what, this guy's lying, and then for the next person to say, yeah, he is. We can show it. But when it comes to that subjective thing and you don't have this easy piece of evidence to say he wasn't lying, or he was lying, like some obvious thing, you can't do it because the bias is going to override. It's going to tip the scales. When you have an even claim, it's going to tip the scales in the favor of police 9 times out of 10. Go watch the video if you can deal with it. When the guy's hand drops, you determine if you think that officer should have put 5 bullets in him. Like, look at the entire scenario, and you determine if 5 bullets needed to go in that guy for his hand dropping down. You determine if they're staring at that guy's butt while he's laying face down. If they can't determine that guy doesn't have a weapon in his waistband, and remember that they're responding to a rifle, right? Like, so the gun that they're talking about The call-in is talking about a rifle, not a handgun. Take all this stuff into consideration. The cops have all of these tools at their disposal. You determine if you think they're guilty or not. I hope this video is helpful. Sorry it's 3 times as long as I said it was going to be, but you'll have to forgive me. Have a good night.